Hi, okay, so we're going to start discussion on systems theory. Systems theory is the second theory, modern theory, that we're going to be talking about. And so when you're thinking or you're being asked to apply theories in lab, this is going to be another major theory that you rely upon and think about. Definitely a current theory. This theory is interesting in that I'm splitting these two theories up, systems theory and dynamic action theory, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But systems theory and dynamic action theory are frequently combined in the PT literature and called dynamic systems theory. So I want you to keep that in mind as we're talking about systems theory, that I've split them out because they originally started as two separate theories, but most of the time today when we're talking about them in physical therapy, we're talking about dynamic systems, which is, again, the combination of systems theory and dynamic action theory. So keep that in mind as we're moving forward in the curriculum. In addition, I want to bring to your attention that if you want to read more about this theory, just this theory alone, split out from dynamic action theory, there is a reading in your book, Shumway, Cook, and Wollicott in Chapter 1, and it would definitely help you if you want to go back and read about systems theory in the chapter. You'll notice that there's quite a few theories covered in that chapter, and so a nice thorough reading of that chapter would probably be a good idea. All right, so as we think about the development of systems theory, there's a little bit of an interesting story behind the development of systems theory, actually. Nikolai Bernstein is the one who is the theorist who's generally credited with initiating this idea of systems theory. He was a Russian neurophysiologist, and he actually was doing his work in the early to mid 1900s, which, as I've said, it's a newer theory. The reason I say it's a newer theory is because we didn't actually discover his work until it was translated to English in 1967, which seems like a while ago to us because we were, well, you weren't alive. I was alive, but a very small child. So it's newer to us simply because it was translated to English then. What's really interesting, and the reason that it wasn't translated until English until that time, was because Nikolai Bernstein was unfortunately on the wrong side of the political arena in Russia, and ended up being exiled in Siberia, and only with difficulty completed his work. The interesting thing about his theory, and what's different about his theory, is he emphasized the body as a mechanical system. So he was actually thinking of the body as this mechanical system that carries out movements. And he included in this, and what is different and new about what he was talking about, is he discussed the influence of gravity, inertia, reactive forces, and initial postural conditions on carrying out movement. So he took this into account when he was talking about this biomechanical system, that as we move, there's these reactive forces that are produced, and that we learn about these reactive forces, and in some instances we utilize or harness some information or some movement that is produced. His initial work was developed using chemocyclography, which is actually filming the a moving body with a mirror behind it. So he actually was able to then, because he had the mirror behind the person moving, examine both sides of the body simultaneously. And he progressed the field from trying to figure out how to measure movement, because now this is actually the birth of the modern 3D motion capture that we're doing now. He moved us from how to measure movement to how to analyze movement. So systems theory has contributed two very important ideas when it comes to motor control and how we're moving. The first idea, is a theory of distributed model of motor control. So in this theory, the same commands from the central or the executive, potentially the brain, saying kick the ball. So if we have a command, kick the ball, this command, even though it's the same command, can result in very different movements. So if we think about the command kick the ball, and if we're standing in a park and we see some kids that are playing soccer and the ball rolls over to us and we want to get it back to them, we may kick the ball gently towards one of the kids. However, the same command, if we're an elite soccer player and we're standing in front of the net of a national or international soccer game and the ball is maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground, if we want to kick the ball into the net, we may do some sort of fancy scissor kick where we're actually kicking in the air, which would look quite different than that little gentle kick, kicking the ball towards the kids. And in the same way with the distributed model, that different commands can actually result in the same movement. So an example of this may be if we're reaching, and we're, in one instance, we're reaching in sitting for something on the table, like the salt container, where we put our hand out and we pull it back to us. That may actually, the basic movement of that may look very similar to, so the command may be, prep my food, get the salt container. We may be reaching into a cabinet or reaching to get some sort of craft supply if we're doing crafts, or a paper or pen to take notes. That may look like a very similar movement, but and it may result from a very different command, executive command of get the salt versus get something else. So the distributed model of motor control actually makes this assertion that the same command can result in very different movement behaviors, and different commands can actually result in very similar behaviors. So that's the first idea that's very unique and is new when we think about systems theory. The second idea is the idea of multiple degrees of freedom. And this was actually sort of a problem when we think about motor control, or some solution needed to be presented, to think about we have redundancies within our body. If you think about lifting your foot over an object, if your foot has to clear the ground by 4 feet or 5 feet or 6 feet, you can do it in a variety of ways. You can, with your knee straight, bring your hip, flex your hip, and dorsiflex, which may bring your foot over. You can also bend your knee, and if you bend your knee and keep your hip extended, you may also lift your foot. More likely, you're going to have a combination of these two, where you have some hip flexion, some knee flexion, and some dorsiflexion. But the combination can occur in a myriad, a lot of different ways to be successful at clearing your foot over this obstacle. So there are many degrees of freedom that we have available in our system, and we need to figure out how is that sort of solved. And Bernstein suggested that we produce, or we develop, synergies. And synergies are actually units of muscles which work together to produce very specific movements. And synergies are ways that we activate multiple joints and muscles, and we use these synergies over a variety of different tasks for a variety of different activities. And so this is he sort of contributes something very unique when he's talking about solving this multiple degrees of freedom, is that we find ways that our bodies are very comfortable to solve issues, and we tend to stick to those solutions or those synergies that we develop. So in systems theory, Bernstein developed what he called core issues and basic principles. And there's actually 10 of them. One of them we talked about, but we're going to spend a few minutes reviewing these core issues and basic principles. So the first principle is that many subsystems work as a unit. So what he thought, and he was theorizing, is there are many subsystems in our body. One subsystem may be the musculoskeletal system. One system may be the neuromotor system. Another system may be sort of those associated balance or postural control system. So there are a lot of different subsystems within the body, and they actually work together as a unit to produce a motor behavior. We talked about the distributed model of motor control, where the same command can result in different movements and different commands can result in the same movement. We already spent a few minutes on that, so I won't review that one. Number 3, subsystems are generally autonomous, but they cooperate with the general needs of the system. So what that means is, my ability to control my posture is autonomous. I learned that. But once I learn it, I cooperate with all the other systems to accomplish and to be successful at whatever motor behavior I need to produce to be successful in the moment. Number 4, a general activity of a subsystem is altered by activation of other subsystems. So if I have an injury or if I have a place in my body that's sore, other subsystems are going to pick up a slack if I can't utilize part of a subsystem. So if I can't use my right arm, I'm going to use my left arm. So in general, specific subsystems can be altered based on the activation of other systems. Executive knowledge, number 5, the executive knowledge is only approximate since tuning of the subsystem in different ways can lead to the same output. So again, this goes back to I have an executive command about step over something, but the amount of flexion that I have at the hip and the knee and the dorsiflexion that I use may vary. It may change based on the moment. Number 6, muscle synergies reduce the mechanical degrees of freedom. I have these synergistic patterns and the muscles work together in a way that is consistent, that once I find a pattern that works for me and is generally successful, I'm going to use it for a variety of tasks and I'm going to reuse that synergy. Number 7, and this is new, and this goes back to his idea about the system as a biomechanical unit. Momentum of movement is used by the system. So once I get momentum when I'm moving, I'm not going to produce a muscle activation when I can just utilize that momentum. So we, through practice and repetition, learn what to expect as a result of momentum or those reactive forces that are produced when we move. And instead of producing that same movement, we just are very conservative of our energy, and we will harness momentum or other reactive forces to help us instead of activating individual muscles. Number 8, general movements are used and fit for a specific task or environment. So again, if we have a synergy or behavior that works for another task in another environment, we're going to try to minimize producing a new or learning a new synergy. We're going to use a synergy and maybe modify it slightly for specific tasks in specific environments. Number 9, the specifics of the environment constrain the degrees of freedom versus increasing it. So again, if we think about specific characteristics of an environment, they're going to dictate for us how we move. So if we are thinking about playing tennis, the net is so high, and so that's going to facilitate or going to make us rely on swings of the tennis racket that are going to produce lift on the ball enough to get it over the net. Or if we think about walking during the winter outside on the East Coast, because it's icy, we're not going to move as rapidly maybe, and we're going to have shorter steps. Secondary to the fact that we can't produce and utilize forces against the surface as much, or we would fall. So again, the environment constrains how we're moving, our degrees of freedom. Number 10, the system is set up to perceive the specific environment and act within it. So all of our behaviors do depend upon the environment and how we're able to move within it, and make our movement successful. So successfully move within it. All right, so we're going to move on next to some limitations. All right, so before we move on to application, let's discuss some of the limitations that we've actually observed in the literature. So systems theory is probably most criticized for its lack of focus on the interaction between the environment and the system. So as you saw when we were reviewing the basic core issues and the core issues and basic principles a minute ago, the last two issues or basic principles do discuss or mention the environment. 9 mentions the specifics of the environment constrain the degrees of freedom versus increasing it, and 10 suggests that the system is set up to perceive the specific environment and act within it. This theory is criticized, though, for not really giving a lot of details about how this happens. So although systems theory definitely doesn't eliminate the environment as something that's important, it doesn't do a lot to discuss how this actually happens. It does a lot more to discuss how the system as a biomechanical unit produces specific motor behaviors and why these motor behaviors may look different. So that is probably the biggest limitation and the biggest criticism of systems theory. As far as clinical applications, as in a minute we're going to stop and think about specifically how this affects what we do as physical therapists. But again, this theory is the first theory to emphasize the mechanical nature of the body. It requires that therapists start understanding mechanical limitations and neurological limitations in their clients. And it emphasizes that therapists must examine the effect of the impairment on multiple subsystems. All right, so we're going to switch next to the slide, and I'm going to ask you to sort of give in detail think about how systems theory affects the history and the way we carry out our history, what's important to us in our history, our examination, our evaluation, and our intervention. So I want you to pull out your table. I'm not going to put the slide up. We'll put it up after the pause. And I want you to really spend a minute thinking about how systems theory is going to affect what we're doing in the clinic, and then also take a few minutes, discuss it with your neighbor or your classmates, and exchange some ideas and really get a good discussion going. All right, once you do that, I want you to come back and we're going to discuss some ideas that I had, and maybe you have some different ideas, but let's just discuss some of the ideas applying systems theory to what we're doing in the clinic. All right, so if we think about if systems theory was actually applied to the clinic, what would be important to think about during my history? Well, again, you're viewing the individual now as a mechanical system. So you want to listen to, or you want to hear anything that may interfere with the functioning of the mechanical system. You also want to think about the proficiency of the skills. How well developed is this skill that this person's having a hard time with? If it's very well developed, they should have a pretty good ability to predict those gravitational and inertial and momentum and the reactive forces that would be produced and harness them. And so you want to listen to how well rehearsed is this. You also want to think about the environment and where the environment and the tasks that were actually done and where they were done. And so this would give you a hint about, is this a behavior that can be utilized for multiple tasks in many environments? So have they developed a synergy, and how strong might that synergy be? For your examination, you're going to do a lot of observation of whatever task it is that that person's having an issue with. You're going to be viewing the body as a mechanical system, so you're going to be looking at what is breaking down in this mechanical system that's not allowing success or that's causing the issue. And you're going to be observing if the person actually does, when they're performing the behavior, the motor behavior, can they harness the forces that are being produced, the gravitational force, the inertial forces, the momentum that's being produced, and any reactive forces. You're also going to be observing very carefully the degrees of freedom that you see while the task is being performed. So do they look stiff or rigid? Are they eliminating movement at a part of the body because they're a new learner? And we're going to talk about this more as we go in the course. Or do they have movement free at all joints and they look pretty relaxed while they're doing the behavior? The other thing is you may want to observe the motor behavior that we're working on in different environments and maybe see if this synergy that they're using or trying to develop can be used for a different task. So do you see this synergy that they need for the task that you're looking at in another task? As far as your evaluation, again, the body is a mechanical system, so you're looking for and thinking about what's the mechanical limitation. How do I increase the degrees of freedom and improve the performer's use of gravity, inertia, and reactive forces? So you're thinking about the subsystems. Are all the subsystems able to function? If there's a subsystem that's missing, that's called a rate limiter, and that could interfere with success of a task. So all of these things, when you're thinking about evaluation, are taken into consideration. And when you're thinking about intervention, you definitely want to think about rehearsal, because rehearsal is going to improve the mechanical efficiency by allowing the person to predict and harness any gravitational forces, inertial forces, any momentum, or any reactive forces that are produced as they're moving. It's going to allow the person to free up degrees of freedom and potentially develop synergies as you're repeating things. And what you also want to do and think about is taking that new behavior, the behavior that you're working on, and using it with different tasks and in different environments, and making that synergy stronger so that that movement, whatever you're working on, can be applied to different tasks and or in different environments. So that sort of concludes our discussion on the systems theory for right now, although you're going to be applying it all throughout the semester and we'll be discussing it more. What I'd like you to do now is look for the next video. In the next video, we're going to be talking about neuronal group selection. So again, keep your handout ready, your table ready, and while we're going through discussing the next theory, you can start filling in some notes, and then you'll get an opportunity to think about it just like we have in the last theories that we've talked about. All right, so now look for neuronal group selection.